So in the last episode, we did a bit of refactoring around fetching followed users, and you can see that's still working here. And today we're now going to look at actually populating the user's feed and listing the posts that they have in their feed. So I've built a server endpoint that finds all the posts from people that a particular user follows. So in this case, it's going to find me the post just from this person called Jenna Smith, because that's the only person that I follow. And today what we're going to do is start fleshing out the types and look a bit at the decoders. In the next episode, we'll then look at how we fetch that data and start putting it onto the page. So I'm using Postman. There'll be a link on screen now to it. It's a desktop client. It's completely free to use that lets you make HTTP requests and see the results. So you can see here I'm making a request to /API/feed. I'm passing in my token. And if we scroll down here and look at the body, you can see we get this array of posts back. So posts have tags, they have a publish date, they have a title, some arbitrary content, and then creates that, updates that, the ID of the post, and then the user who actually created that post. So you can see here this is Jenna Smith's post. So we have one post that's tagged with screencast, one that's tagged with announcements, and one that's tagged with coding. And they all have the published information, and we want to start displaying that on the page. So normally at this point, what I would do is actually just copy this big thing in. And then we'll go back into our types file in our distinctly average code base and start fleshing out the actual types. So I've just pasted in the file here just so we can get a look at it. And what I'm going to do now is, like, for example, I don't need the content there. I just need to know what the key is. So we'll get rid of that. And that saves us a bit of room. And now I would start converting this into an actual type. So we'll say type feed post. And again, with Elm, I don't worry too much about getting the naming right straight away because I know it's so easy to update that if I do want to. So we'll just stick with feed post as a good starting point. So it's going to have some tags, and they are going to be a list of strings. In other parts of the code base for types, we've wrapped the string or int types in our own type. So we might call this a list of tag. But for now, because I don't really know how we're going to use tags, I'm just going to stick to them being strings. We're going to have a published at, which is going to be a string for now. And again, we'll consider if we want to turn this into a proper date in a minute. We're going to have a title, which is a string. Content, which is a string. Created at and updated at, we actually probably don't need to worry about. So these are the actual database entries where the post was first created or updated. The actual one we would show to the user is published at, because you imagine that the person who's published this blog post will have edited it, had it as a draft for a while. So we only actually care about published at, so we can ignore those other two. We will need to know its ID, and we'll call that an int for now, but we'll almost certainly come back and make that a post ID type. And then we need to decide what we care about for the user. Now, if you remember, we already have the fetched followed users in our actual state. If you look at a user, we have a list of these followed users that they're following. So we actually already have this user floating around, so we wouldn't necessarily need to go and refetch or pull in all the information again. Just store the user's ID, and then we can decide later what we want to do to fetch the data for that user's ID. And that's it. So that is going to be what our post will come down to. So let me just delete the rest of this file. And of course, it's erroring because this shouldn't be type feed post, it should be type alias feed post because it's a record. And it looks like we have some syntax errors, so just try and figure out what I've done wrong here. And I've got another one too many commas. There we go. And we have user here, which is an int. I'm actually going to update this field to be user ID. Or actually, let's change it to author ID, because that's a bit more clear what the user is that is attached to it. And if we remember, in this types file, we already have a user ID type. So we can reuse this type down in our author ID. So let's call that user ID. In fact, I'm going to undo my mind again. Because the type is user ID, I think it makes sense for the field to be user ID. I think it's probably obvious enough that if a feed post has an ID, it's probably the author. And this ID too, I don't like ID as a generic term, so we're going to call this post ID, and we are going to create a post ID type as well. So we'll say type post ID equals post ID string, not an int as well, because the strings are big long tokens that could have letters in. So it's strings, not integers. So let's go and look at how we can actually start decoding this. The first question is, where do we put this? We do have this API file which has lots of decoders, but looking at it, and I'm scrolling through this, although we've called this file api.elm, it's actually purely worried about users. It either fetches our authenticated user using the /me endpoint, or it fetches any arbitrary user. And all the decoding in here is all about users. So there's actually nothing currently in this module that is specific to, is not specific, is more general. It's all about users. So what I'm thinking, and I'm going to leave ourselves at to do, is we're probably going to rename this file to api.users or similar. And I want to do that because I think that this file really is all about users, and we'll create another file now that's going to contain our actual feed. So I'm going to go into source and we'll create a new file in here for now and call it feed.elm. Let's go for that. In fact, no, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a new folder in here called API. I'm going to create a new file inside here called feed.elm. And this is where we'll host all the API HTTP logic for feeds, including the decoders. So in Elm, the module name of the file is based not only on the file name, but also the directory structure. So we've put this feed file inside an API folder. So the module that this contains is called api.feed. And for now, we'll put it exposing ... as always. And so let's import some things. We're going to always need to import types, exposing everything, for sure. We'll go into API because we're going to need probably these methods too. I've got 2 types. Okay, and we're getting errors here because there's no body to this module yet, so Elm doesn't really know what to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this feed post, I'm going to copy it and put it in here and comment it out, just so we have something to refer to. Let's write a feed post decoder. So our API is going to return us a list of posts, but for now we're just going to worry about decoding a single one. So this will be a decoder of type feed post. Okay. So if we look how many fields we have here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this will be d.map6. And we're going to map it to a feed post. And then let's work our way through the fields. So we'll say d.field tags. And this is d.list of d.string. Remember, d here is the JSON decode module here. So there's our tags, and let me just copy these because we need lots of fields. The second field is published at. And again, for now, this is just a string, but we might change this to be a date in a future video. We're going to have title, which is also a string. In here, we're going to have content, which again is just a string. And then we're going to have post ID. And I'm going to, for now, what we're going to do is we'll say post ID decoder, which we haven't built yet. And then we'll say user ID, and this is a user ID decoder. Now, if we go into api.elm, I think we do indeed have a user ID decoder. So what we'll do for now, it's going to be a little odd because we know we want to move and rename this file, but I'm actually going to expose the user ID decoder because we're definitely going to want it. Then in feed.elm, we can say import API exposing user ID decoder. Okay, so that all looks right. We haven't got the post ID decoder. I'll ignore that error for now under feed post and just define post ID decoder. It's a decoder that can return post ID. So a post ID decoder is going to decode something to a string, and it's going to map that. So we'll say d.map post ID d.string. Okay, and so we've got errors over post ID, cannot find the type, and feed post is the same thing. And I think this is going to be because we need to go into our types and we need to expose it. So we'll go into here and we'll say feed post and post ID. And again, I've got too many commas. Okay, so our decoder is looking good. Again, probably we'll change publish that to a date once we start working with it and say we want to output it as a nicely formatted date, but we'll leave it for now. Finally, what I'll do is I'll just remove that comments out code, and we now have a decoder. We've made a mistake here. Cannot find a post ID constructor. Okay, let's go and have a look at what I've done wrong. I think I might have defined this slightly incorrectly. So the user ID decoder is the exact same. We map over the user ID. So let me go back to our types and find the post ID type. Type post ID equals post ID string. That looks pretty good to me. User ID equals user ID string. Type post ID equals post ID string. Cannot find a post ID constructor. I know what I've done wrong. Up here, when I expose post ID, I need to expose the constructors for it too, which I do by putting brackets and ... There we go. So I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, we'll pick right up where we just left off, and we'll start making a request and decoding and just logging these out into the browser.